Now, it's a bit of a tickle trying to unite three different strands. We have World AIDS Day. By the way, it's getting very dark in here, isn't it? We had the custodian of the church come by beforehand and said we've got some fuse problems, and it didn't look too bad, but of course it gets dark outside, doesn't it? And so it gets darker in here. So it's just like a sort of a romantic glow that you're all sat in. So, you know, unfortunately I'm in stark bright light, and I've been sat outside in the hot sun in Washington Square for an hour, so I probably look like a beetroot. Sorry, a beet, isn't it? Yes. And again, I have to remind you, it's at that point when you say, no, Pastor, you don't look like a beetroot, you look wonderful. Thank you. Now, this has been read to me, and I've been read it since I was a little boy. We used to do tableaux vivants, or tableaus, when I was a little child, you know, like everyone does, nativity scenes with Mary and with baby Jesus and everything else, and we'd have the readings through Advent coming up to it. And it's easy to forget that Mary was not in an ordinary situation, and Mary was not being asked here to do something ordinary. So I put in capital letters on here, or rather I put in bold, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord, let it be with me according to your word." Now, she hadn't been asked if she would turn up for church, whether she would do the flower arranging, or whether she would give somebody a ride after church. She'd been asked to allow, and I say allow because this is the crux of what I'm going to speak about, to allow the Holy Spirit to come upon her and do something not only miraculous and extraordinary, but more to the point, something so far outside her social frame of reference that it made her a pariah. She was being asked to become a teenage mother without a husband and explain it furthermore to everybody that she expected would be completely disbelieving. As Joseph went to her as soon as he discovered and said he would put her quietly aside to save her shame because he expected that she would be stoned to death. So she was not saying yes to anything easy. She wasn't saying yes to a pleasant pregnancy and a nice little baby which she'd always wanted. She would have thought she was probably saying yes to social ostracization and being stoned to death for being a harlot. But she said yes. Now, speaking of harlots, that was supposed to be light-hearted. Speaking of harlots, and please, 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 when we go to church in Baton Rouge next Sunday at 11 o'clock in the morning to see Troy Perry, there you see how I did that? It's very neatly getting in the reminder that we have church at 11 o'clock in the morning next Sunday in Baton Rouge instead of here. Don't tell Troy Perry that I called him a harlot. But the truth is that Troy Perry, from the first, as soon as he received his prophecy from the mouth of God, and that prophecy was, "I love you as I made you." Because Troy Perry had been to hell and back. He had lost his marriage, his church, he'd lost pretty much everything. He was a Church of God pastor. He started out in Florida. He felt that the support of his family would go away as soon as he was exposed as being a gay man. His best friend had been arrested, and he was suicidal. So he contemplated suicide, and he attempted suicide, and he did what many people have done in their life, and they basically perform a sort of dance around despair. Despair becomes the partner in your life, for a short span or a long span. But despair is always the negation of the good news. Despair is always about turning your back on the possibilities that God has in any life, no matter how long, no matter how decrepit, no matter how unhappy. Despair is saying no to God in profound and stark ways. And Troy Perry felt despair. But as he was laying there recovering with his wrists bandaged up, he had a very strong inspiration of the Holy Spirit, something he hadn't had for a long time. He'd been pastoring churches since the age of 14 or 15, if I remember correctly. He'd been preaching, he was ordained at a very early age. But it had been a long time since he had the presence of God with him in his life, like he did when he was lying on that hospital bed with his wrists bandaged up. And God said, "I love you just as you are." Perry heard something else besides just, I love you just as you are. If he just heard, I love you just as you are, he might have lied in his bed with a beautiful, blissful glow on his face for a few weeks, and then he might have gone about his business and lived the rest of his life in the firm and glorious knowledge that he wasn't outcast and hell-bound, but he was a beloved child of God, made as God intended. But he heard something else. What he heard was a question within what he was told, and the question was, now you know that you are as I made you, do you see what you have to do? Now, Troy Perry interpreted that as saying that because he was okay, he was a gay man, he knew he'd been gay since the moment he was old enough to think about such things. And as soon as he realized that God loved him as he was, and that he was part of God's plan for his life, he realized, well, that doesn't just apply to me. That applies to pretty much all my brothers and sisters, and therefore I have something to say. Consequently, he gathered up his not inconsiderable powers of preaching and teaching, and he started a ministry which began in 1968 and continues to the present day. There are now 45,000 members. There are 22 different countries that have MCC churches in them. There are several hundred MCCs in this country alone. The latest church to join was just 2 weeks ago. A Church for Me, it's called, in Chicago. And it's a radical new way of doing church. It's full of young people, and it is growing very rapidly. We actually have just been featured in the Region 2 newsletter and everything else. And Nancy Wilson phoned me, the new head of our fellowship, telling me that we are an example to the other churches in the fellowship. But don't forget for 1 second, we all came, and our presence here came from Troy Perry saying yes to God in a very profound and honest way. And his yes was not, yes, I'll go to church, yes, I'll start talking to you again, yes, I'll start preaching. He knew from the beginning that it was going to be a lifelong venture. Troy Perry's journey hasn't finished. He has retired as a moderator of metropolitan community churches across the world, but he's still turning up in Baton Rouge to preach to the likes of you and me next week. Thank God. Now, I had a humble yes. I told you about it last August. My yes was going against the advice of absolutely everybody I'd asked and coming to New Orleans, because everybody told me that you can't do church in New Orleans. Well, let me let you into a secret. As soon as I came here last August and met Miss Charlene, sat down here on the front row, I realized that not only could you, but you must. Because if there were people like Miss Charlene ready to meet me when we came to New Orleans, then it was worth coming here to do our damnedest and to tap into the abilities and the passions and the faith of the people in this city to build something substantial, something wonderful, something growing, something with no limits to its growth, and something which will be growing for many years yet. So if you ever get really sick and tired of me, you need to turn your energies to Charlene and blame her. Or Leon. Because I have to say, if Leon hadn't have shared that vision, I couldn't have come here. Sometimes it takes 2 yeses to get God's work done, not just one. And I think it goes without saying frequently that when pastors are up here pontificating and people say, oh, you're a wonderful pastor, sometimes they forget about the partner, and I'd like you to give Leon a round of applause if you could. Because the man can say. Troy Perry, I'm not going to preach endlessly about Troy Perry. You can hear a lot about Troy Perry when you actually go and hear him preach next Sunday. But what I would say is that Troy Perry's vision and Troy Perry's yes to God was not all of this. It didn't suddenly become a fabulous world-girdling denomination, and some would say it still isn't. It was a struggle. Churches were burned down. Pastors were attacked. The Ku Klux Klan got involved. It was a major struggle for many, many years. The Mother Church